On November 21st, 1950, a regimental combat team of the U.S. 7th Division entered the North Korean border village of Haisanjin. Across the Yalu River, American troops looked for the first time at the frozen wastes of Manchuria. With the war in Korea just 5 months old, the United Nations Army stood at victory's threshold. A Thanksgiving dinner in the field was sweetened by the thoughts of Christmas at home. Nearby, in the area of the Chosin Reservoir, 2 regiments of the 1st Marine Division prepared to launch their final offensive of the war. Despite ominous signs of Chinese intervention, they moved north to seek out the bloodied survivors of the North Korean Army. Then, with bone-chilling suddenness, thousands of Chinese regulars swarmed out of the hills and attacked the Marine column. The road behind them was cut. Ahead, the frozen mountains teemed with a new enemy. The trapped Americans began a nightmarish withdrawal. With victory slipping from his grasp, Douglas MacArthur called it an entirely new war. It was the spring of 1950, and life in America was placid and prosperous. 5 years of peace had helped dim the painful memories of World War II. But elsewhere, the world was again unrestful. In China, the communists had driven Chiang Kai-shek into exile on Formosa. In Indochina, communist insurgents threatened to end French rule. At home, the spread of communism was also a major topic. Senator Joseph McCarthy had carved out a dubious reputation with charges the State Department was red-infested, and the entire Truman administration was soft on communism. With their armed forces gutted by post-war demobilization, America was forced to concentrate her limited military capability in Europe, where the powerful Russian army posed a grave threat to the weaker NATO countries. In the Far East, the United States had guaranteed the security of the Philippines and Formosa. But South Korea, where rumors persisted that a takeover by the communist North was imminent, had been excluded from the nation's defensive perimeter. Against this background, on a quiet Sunday in June 1950, Korea exploded, and America was again at war.
We will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
World War II. Moments of sadness. Moments of joy. For 3.5 soul-searing years, a nation's youth had struggled bravely in defense of liberty. Out of the grief and anguish, America emerged, powerful and united as never before. Long-delayed dreams were fulfilled. Promises were kept. America looked to the future, confident and secure. It was the best of times. Following its defeat by the Allies, the Japanese army was quickly demobilized, its war-making potential destroyed. After the surrender in Tokyo Bay, General Douglas MacArthur remained in Japan to head up the American occupation and guide the post-war rehabilitation of the Japanese. Democracy was introduced. Reforms instituted. Curiously, MacArthur soon became a beloved father figure to those he had helped conquer. In its rush to demobilize, America's army had fallen upon hard times. Under strength, poorly trained, these weekend warriors were hardly adequate to deal with the mounting pressures of the post-war world. In Europe, the Soviets were saber-rattling. America's control of the atom bomb maintained a tenuous balance of power. Russia was on the verge of achieving her own nuclear capability. Despite MacArthur's strict rule over the Japanese, the readiness level of his occupation forces was sadly deficient. Low-grade, soft, unmotivated, the men were little more than a constabulary force deployed to prevent a resurgence of Japanese militarism. As the 40s ended, Washington continued to view Europe as the nation's first line of defense. But elsewhere, in the Far East, pressures were building. Korea, a 500-mile mountainous peninsula jutting southward from Manchuria, had been a centuries-old invasion route during frequent hostilities between Russia, China, and Japan. For much of its troubled history, the small nation had been, in the words of an ancient Korean proverb, like a shrimp caught in a battle of whales. Under Japanese control, it was used at the 1945 Potsdam Conference as attractive bait to lure Russia into the Pacific War. Stalin's army had suffered obscene losses during its bitter four-year struggle with Nazi Germany. The Russian victory at Stalingrad was followed by a relentless pursuit to the heart of Berlin. In August 1945, as agreed, Soviet troops occupied northern Korea. Suddenly, the war was over, and U.S. forces moved into the southern part of the country. The 38th parallel was chosen as a dividing line between the two Koreas. Intent upon molding a satellite state in the industrial north, the Russians selected guerrilla leader Kim Il-sung to lead a puppet government. Fiery Dr. Syngman Rhee, longtime activist for Korean independence, was America's choice to govern the agrarian South. March 1948. Under United Nations supervision, elections were held in South Korea. Russia refused to allow similar voting in the north. By the fall of that year, the United States and Russia agreed to withdraw their forces. Each country left military advisors in its sector of influence. With the superpowers gone, tensions mounted. Both Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee had clear designs on the other's territory. In the Chinese Civil War, the communist victory over Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists had sharply increased the likelihood of a North Korean attempt to take over the South. But Washington considered South Korea little more than a diplomatic Siberia, a place to banish civil servant misfits and malcontents, a country in which the U.S. military said it had little strategic interest. Sunday, June 25th, 1950. It began with an ear-shattering ferocity as North Korean artillery opened up all along the 38th parallel. Tanks rumbled across the frontier. The infantry followed. South Korean border units, many of whose soldiers had been given leave to work in the rice paddies, were quickly overrun. 90,000 Soviet-trained North Korean regulars moved out in a four-pronged drive toward the south. A Republic of Korea, or ROK, regiment was slaughtered by 2 North Korean divisions. The defenders crumbled before the might of Kim Il-sung's forces. President Truman rushed back to Washington from his home in Missouri. Late Sunday, he requested an emergency session of the UN Security Council. That evening, the United Nations Security Council called for the cessation of hostilities and withdrawal of all North Korean forces from the South. South Korea's military situation worsened, Truman ordered General MacArthur to provide naval and air support to the beleaguered ROK forces, including attacks on North Korean columns. June 27th. In a second resolution, the United Nations called upon all member states to furnish such assistance as is necessary to repel the armed attack. As the invaders resumed their drive toward the South Korean capital of Seoul, MacArthur asked for assistance. Truman and his aides met to consider committing U.S. forces to the conflict. After less than 5 years of peace, America was again at the brink of war. The war was less than 72 hours old as North Korean assault units closed on Seoul. The capital was in turmoil. President Ri had abandoned the city and fled south. His action brought increased panic. Refugees crowded the roads. Soldier-filled military vehicles followed. The South Korean retreat had become a rout. Early on June 28th, the Han River Bridge was blown while crowded with fleeing people. Hundreds died in the tragedy. American involvement in the war escalated by the hour. Elements of the U.S. 7th Fleet steamed out of the Philippines to blockade the Korean coast and provide air support for the retreating ROK Army. Other fleet units began a tense patrol of the waters between Formosa and China, ordered to prevent contact between the opposing forces of Chiang Kai-shek and the mainland communists. Pursuant to President Truman's authorization, MacArthur ordered the Far East Air Force into action. In a maximum show of force, bombers hit rail yards at Munsan near the 38th parallel, inflicting heavy damage. For the first time, North Korean targets were locked in American bomb sites. At the air base at Itazuki, Japan, F-80 jets took off for strafing and rocket attacks against the enemy columns moving on Seoul. When the first Russian-built Yak fighter was shot down, Truman was delighted. "I hope it won't be the last," he said. With the enemy at the gates of Seoul, MacArthur flew to Korea for a first-hand look. Said the general, "The only way to judge a fight is to see it yourself." He watched the pitiful exodus from the South Korean capital. With gloomy battle reports in hand, President Truman acted to stem the tide of North Korea's aggression. He committed American ground forces in order to protect U.S. interests. Several days later, their use in combat areas was also authorized. While Congress largely supported the president's action, some members were critical. Republican Senator Robert A. Taft charged that American involvement in the war was a result of a bungling and inconsistent foreign policy. Taft accused Truman of usurping the constitutional authority of Congress to commit American forces to battle. But MacArthur now had his troops. On July 2nd, 1950, a battalion of the 24th Division's 21st Regiment took off from Japan. Commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Brad Smith, these first American combat troops arrived at Korea's southern port of Pusan. Designated Task Force Smith, they were ordered north to confront the advancing enemy. It was hoped that the disintegrating ROK Army would rally around the Americans. But Colonel Smith's contingent, welcomed by cheering South Koreans, was ill-prepared for battle. Accompanied by a supporting artillery unit, Task Force Smith was taken by train and truck close to enemy-held Osan, south of Seoul. On July 5th, positioned on twin hills overlooking the North Korean line of advance, Smith's men did battle with an enemy 10 times their number. The lopsided fight was over in several hours. Enemy tanks, impervious to Smith's aging anti-tank ammunition, forced the heavily outnumbered Americans to retreat. Sometime on that fateful morning in early July, the machine gunner of Task Force Smith, whose name has been lost to history, became America's first battle death of the Korean War. The suicidal effort to stop the North Koreans had failed. Air action against the enemy increased. But aerial maps, the result of a 20-year-old Japanese survey, often proved inaccurate. Mistakes were made. Thousands of South Korean civilians and United Nations military fell victim to these misdirected air attacks. On July 7th, a Security Council resolution recommended the establishment of a unified command in Korea. The following day, at their request, President Truman announced the appointment of General Douglas MacArthur as Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Command. President Rhee placed all ROK forces under the new UN commander. The military situation worsened by the hour. MacArthur called for more troops. Elements of the U.S. 24th and 25th Divisions arrived from Japan. Though woefully unprepared for battle, they were sped to the front to confront the onrushing enemy. On July 13th, Lieutenant General Walton H. Walker, a tough, barrel-chested tank veteran of World War II, took field command of all UN forces in Korea. They were designated the 8th Army. As the North Korean advance moved dangerously close to the UN stronghold at Taizhan, Walker ordered his men to hold. Help was on the way. The question was, would it arrive in time? It was mid-July, and all across Korea, the enemy offensive pounded at the rapidly crumbling United Nations line. Day by day, the 8th Army was being squeezed into an ever smaller portion of the southeast. As reinforcements arrived, they were rushed to the front. The U.S. 24th Division took up positions along the Kum River, north of Taizhan. The 25th moved up on their right. The 1st Cavalry Division dug in north of Pohang-dong. At Camp Pendleton, California, a brigade of the 1st Marine Division built around his 5th Regiment held a final review prior to departing for the war zone. Known as the 1st Marine Provisional Brigade, the unit was under the command of Brigadier General Edward A. Craig. Much of the brigade's equipment was pulled out of mothballed retirement. Along with the veteran 5th Marines, it was ready to be tested anew. In early July, the Marines left Pendleton and boarded ships bound for Japan. Midway between Seoul and Busan, the 24th Division, under Major General William F. Dean, had been engaged in critical delaying actions north of Taizhan. Forced to retreat across the Kum River and back to that city, they blew the bridge behind them. Inside Taizhan, the 24th waited for the pursuing enemy to appear. For 3 days, they struggled furiously, offering the fiercest resistance yet encountered by the North Korean army. General Dean was at the center of the fighting. But overwhelmed by superior numbers, the 24th was forced to give ground. On July 20th, Taijan fell. Dean, cut off from his troops, was captured after a 35-day effort to reach friendly lines. At home, recognizing the increasing demands of an escalating war, President Truman asked Congress for an unprecedented $10 billion to finance a UN police action, a Truman euphemism for the Korean conflict. In addition, the Pentagon was authorized to raise an army in excess of 3 million men. In Korea, as enemy pressure increased, General Walker pulled back his lines in order to shorten the front. The perimeter before Pusan tightened still more. Following the general line of the Nakhtong River, it now stretched in a quarter circle, southwest to northeast, sea to sea, at an 80-mile radius from Pusan. As the UN line continued to recede, the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, bound for Japan, was diverted to Korea to meet the rising threat. By late July, Walker had withdrawn his army to the south bank of the Nakhtong for a final stand. Heavy pressure soon developed at Chinju in the southwest. Only 55 miles from Pusan, its capture would threaten the entire perimeter with collapse. Walker rallied his troops. "There will be no more retreating," he said. "There will be no Dunkirk. There will be no Bataan. We are going to win." To the beleaguered GIs, the message was clear: stand or die. To meet the threat at Chinju, the 25th Division under Major General William B. Keane was rushed to the southwest to support the 24th. On August 7th, the 8th anniversary of their division's historic landing at Guadalcanal, 6,000 men of the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, with supporting Marine air units, entered the battle. As part of Task Force Keane, they moved against the powerful North Korean 6th Division. In the first 8th Army victories of the war, Kosong and Sashan fell to the scrappy Marines. During this action, helicopters were used for the first time to evacuate wounded men from the battlefield. In another combat first, Marine aviators dropped deadly napalm in support of the ground forces. Before the Marines could exploit their gains, an enemy attack in the northern sector of the perimeter established a dangerous beachhead across the Nakhtong. The UN stronghold at Taegu was seriously threatened. Walker ordered the Marine Brigade North to plug the hole in his line. During the ensuing action, fought in a jumbled mass of ridges, the Marines engaged in several days of brutal fighting. At a place called No Name Ridge, men of the brigade suffered terrible casualties while seizing the high ground. On August 17th, as a now fleeing enemy attempted to recross the Nakhtong, they were slaughtered by strafing and bombing attacks. On the perimeter's eastern flank, ROK troops were driven out of Pohang Dong. Some of their units had to be evacuated by sea. UN planes were hastily flown from Pohang Dong's airstrip. But 5 days of enemy pressure failed to take the airfield, and the North Koreans were finally driven from the city. At the same time, the strong enemy offensive aimed at Taegu was contained with the help of concentrated air attacks. On August 31st, the North Koreans struck with tremendous force all along the Nakhtong line. Pohang Dong fell for a second time. the beleaguered UN defenders withdrew to Taegu for the last-ditch stand. For more than a week, the 8th Army engaged in some of the hardest fighting of the war. Walker's troops held at all points. Numerous enemy beachheads across the Naktong were eliminated. By mid-September, with its elongated supply lines under constant attack, the North Korean offensive ground to a halt. The perimeter had held. The UN's costly gamble of trading space for time had succeeded. The weary Marine Brigade was withdrawn from the line. They assembled at the port of Pusan, prepared to lead Douglas MacArthur's new, even greater gamble. One that would dramatically alter the course of the war. The UN line now stabilized in the south. Douglas MacArthur proposed a daring plan that he said would quickly end the war. North Korean supply lines were now dangerously extended. Their army was wholly dependent on supplies flowing through a critical road and rail junction at Seoul, halfway up the peninsula. MacArthur's plan: to land amphibious forces at Incheon, east of Seoul, quickly seize the capital, and cut the enemy's line of supply. Coupled with an 8th Army breakout in the south, it would trap the North Koreans between the two UN armies and end the war. The plan had its problems. The port of Incheon, accessible only through 2 narrow channels, had sweeping tides that rose and fell up to 30 feet within hours. Support ships could go aground on the thick mudflats exposed during low tide. Said one critic, make a list of amphibious don'ts, and that's Incheon. Encouraged perhaps by his stunning successes with similar operations during World War II, MacArthur persisted. No one chose to stop him. With Incheon, the war was about to enter a new and highly controversial phase. In preparation for the landing at Incheon, the main body of the hastily assembled 1st Marine Division prepared to depart from California. As their brothers in the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade fought desperately to hold the Pusan perimeter, the regulars and reservists boarded transports bound for Japan. General J. Lawton Collins, Army Chief of Staff, and Admiral Forrest Sherman, Chief of Naval Operations, arrived in Tokyo to discuss a controversial Incheon plan with MacArthur. Privately, the rankled UN commander complained that Collins's visit was not so much to discuss as to dissuade. Collins proposed alternate, less risky landing sites, but MacArthur brushed aside all his objections. Selected to land behind the Marine Assault Regiments was Major General David Barr's 7th Infantry Division, pulled from occupation duty in Japan. Major General Edward W. Almond, MacArthur's Chief of Staff and confidant, an impatient, whip-cracking officer, was chosen to command the 28,000-man Incheon invasion force, designated the 10th Corps. In mid-September, Admiral James Doyle's task force left Japan, carrying the 7th Division and the 1st Marine Regiment. The Marine Brigade, just released from combat duty on the perimeter, had shipped out of Pusan. On the Pusan perimeter, General Walker's 8th Army, minus the Marine Brigade, consolidated its positions in preparation for an offensive in conjunction with the landings at Incheon. Air operations against the invasion area began. The island of Wolmi-do, guarding Incheon's harbor, was a target of concentrated attacks. At the same time, Navy jets struck at North Korean airfields. Other targets of opportunity within a 100-mile range of the city were also hit. Alternate landing sites were attacked to confuse the enemy. Before dawn on September 15th, the naval guns began their deadly work. Wolmi-do, the first landing site, shuddered under the force of the barrage. The harbor's sweeping tides dictated an early morning landing. High tide would last less than 3 hours, after which the support ships would have to withdraw. The Marines would then be isolated on Wolney until the landings at Incheon on the evening tide. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, having raced up Flying Fish Channel during the night in transports, hit the Wolney beaches at 0633. They encountered light, inaccurate fire. Aboard his flagship, Douglas MacArthur watched the opening moments of the invasion. Ashore, the 3rd Battalion fanned out and moved inland. 6 Pershing tanks joined the action. MacArthur saw the flag raise atop Radio Hill. "That's it," he said. "Let's get some coffee." Ashore, the Marines fought across Wolney. The enemy was routed from his fortified positions. In some places, die-hard defenders were entombed inside their bunkers. Marine fighters flew in close support of the operation, pounding the Wolney hills with rockets and napalm. Within an hour, half of the island was in Marine hands. The long causeway leading to Incheon was blocked to prevent enemy reinforcements from moving across from the mainland. By 0800, Wolney was secured. As the tide moved out, the support ships backed away. Taplett's Marines were alone. By late afternoon, as the tide began to rise, the 1st and 5th Marine Regiments headed for shore and the main landing at Incheon. Some of the barges had Truman's police force painted on the side. The naval barrage began, blasting the landing area and its approaches. Above, low-flying fighters swept across Incheon, their blazing attacks meant to isolate the landing points. A pall of thick smoke soon covered the city. The landing plan called for 2 battalions of Lieutenant Colonel Ray Murray's 5th Regiment to land at Red Beach, a stone seawall at the edge of Incheon City. At the same time, Chesty Puller's 1st Marines were to go ashore at Blue Beach, 3 miles to the southeast. After landing, the 5th Marines would attack through the city while the 1st Regiment enveloped it. At Red Beach, the 5th Regiment reached shore at 5:33 p.m., taking immediate fire from nearby bunkers. The Marines moved inland to seek out the entrenched enemy. To the south, the 1st Regiment's assault was a bit more chaotic, with several units landing at the wrong place. Colonel Chesty Puller's Marines scaled a 15-foot seawall and moved inland against sporadic fire. They quickly established a firm beachhead and cut the southern approaches to Incheon City. By day's end, 13,000 troops were ashore, including weapons and equipment. Casualties had been light. As the tide receded, some of the support ships went aground on the oozing mudflats. All key points within Incheon City were in Marine hands. But the capital at Seoul still lay 25 miles away, and enemy reinforcements were speeding toward the beachhead. September 16th, D+1. 1st Division Marines moved westward out of Incheon City. Korean troops were left behind to clean out lingering pockets of resistance. Since North Korean reinforcements were moving to block the invasion, a speedy advance on Seoul was essential. Carrier-based Marine F-4U Corsairs took off to seek out enemy targets. North Korean troop trains racing toward Incheon were destroyed by the rampaging Corsairs. The Marine regiments had 2 immediate objectives. While Colonel Ray Murray's 5th Marines moved through Abscom City, then north toward Kimpo Airfield, Chesty Puller's 1st Regiment struck east for Yongdong-po, an industrial suburb on the west bank of the Han River. The first day's advance saw the Marines move 10 miles closer to the capital. Early on the second morning, a column of North Korean tanks and infantry was destroyed in a sharp firefight. Later that morning, General MacArthur, elated by the success of the landings, came ashore to congratulate General Smith. Then he personally inspected the scene of the battle. Having swept through Abscom City, the 5th Marines lay siege to Kimpo Airfield. By D+3, the strip was in American hands, and Marines held positions overlooking the Han River. At Kimpo, cargo planes began unloading to supplement the supplies being brought ashore at Incheon. By September 19th, soldiers of the Army's 7th Division had landed at Incheon to join the battle. Led by Major General David Barr, they moved south towards Suwon to block the southern approaches to Seoul. With the 5th Marines already at the Han, the 1st Regiment prepared for an assault on Yongdong-po. Their attack set the industrial suburb afire. Yongdong-po burned through the night of September 20th. Early on the 21st, the 1st Regiment launched an attack. After intense fighting, the city was taken. Earlier that day, after a previous attempt had failed, a company of the 5th Regiment's 3rd Battalion made a successful assault crossing of the Han. On the east bank, Hill 125, a nest of enemy resistance was cleaned out. With the high ground now secure, the remaining elements of the 5th Marines crossed the river and massed for an attack on Seoul. As Armin's 10th Corps readied its assault on the capital, MacArthur expressed hopes for its fall by September 25th, 3 months after the North Koreans had launched their invasion. On September 22nd, the attack on the city commenced when Colonel Murray's 5th Marines began their advance from a mountainous region northwest of the capital. Enemy concentrations holding Hill 296 across the Marines' line of advance had to be dug out and eliminated. Marine fighters prowled the lines, pouring rockets and napalm into the Korean positions. Finally, the enemy perimeter cracked. As the 5th Marine advance continued, Puller's 1st Marines moved out of Yongdong-po and launched their own attack toward the center of Seoul. Earlier on September 16th, as part of General MacArthur's Incheon invasion plan, Walton Walker's 8th Army had begun its offensive aimed at breaking out of the Pusan area. Their goal, to link up with General Armin's 10th Corps on the Incheon-Seoul line 180 miles to the north. But Walker's long and wearying defense of the perimeter, plus the loss of the crack Marine Brigade to the Incheon operation, has seriously affected his ability to move forward. In fact, most 8th Army units remained on the defensive. Two developments broke the stalemate. As the weather cleared, Air Force bombers began a relentless pounding of the enemy's positions. Then, as word of the Incheon landing trickled down the peninsula, North Korean troops in the line panicked. Fearful of entrapment, they hurriedly withdrew. As the enemy front disintegrated, elements of Walker's 1st Corps crossed the Naktong River and began an advance to the north. On Korea's east coast, the port of Pohangdong again fell to the ROK 3rd Division. Expanding the assault on Seoul, the 7th Division's 32nd Infantry also crossed the Han River. The 10th Corps' General Almond watched the operation. Once across, the Army units advanced on the city from the southeast. UN artillery zeroed in on the capital, blasting Seoul around the clock. Carrier and land-based planes softened up the position of General Knowles' 10,000 defenders. But the enemy was dug in and barricaded. As the soldiers and Marines drove into the outskirts of the South Korean capital, it was clear that the impending battle for Seoul would be fierce and costly. It was September 24th, and 2 regiments of the 1st Marine Division slashed into the heavily fortified South Korean capital. From the beginning, General Knowles' troops resisted fanatically, machine gun, mortar, and small arms fire. While Murray's 5th Regiment drove in from the northwest, Chesty Puller's 1st Marines assaulted the city's center. In the southwest, the 7th Division's 32nd Infantry attacked alongside the 17th Rock Regiment. To the north, Colonel Homer Litzenberg's newly landed 7th Marines enveloped Seoul to block the northern escape route. General Almond pressured Marine General Oliver Smith to press his offensive, bypassing enemy strong points if necessary. The Seoul fighting was street to street, house to house. Enemy barricades were encountered at each corner. Snipers were everywhere. In the thick of the smoke-filled action, children ran about playing soldier with wooden guns. The battle raged into the 25th. Although sharp fighting continued, General Almond announced that Seoul was in UN hands. Said one correspondent, "If this city has been liberated, someone forgot to tell the North Koreans." Marine casualties were horrendous. During one 24-hour period, a company of 206 men and 176 of their number killed or wounded. Gains were measured in yards. Everywhere the enemy had to be blasted from his fortified positions. Above the charred capital, American planes swooped low to attack North Korean strong points, adding their thunderous voice to the agonized cries of a dying city. UN reinforcements continued to enter the battle zone. At Kimpo Airfield, the 187th Regimental Combat Team, an airborne unit, arrived to bolster the area's defenses and prepare for imminent action. To the south, 8th Army tanks continued their pursuit of the battered North Korean forces. On the morning of September 27th, after a lightning thrust up the Korean peninsula, L Troop of the 1st Cavalry Division 7th Regiment made contact with the 7th Division's 31st Infantry above Osan. The 8th Army and the 10th Corps were now joined, trapping thousands of North Koreans in the south. In Seoul, the enemy's futile defense slowly petered out. Final pockets of resistance were eliminated. By the 28th, the blackened city was again in UN hands. Only a handful of General Knowles' forces were able to escape north. Enemy resistance in South Korea had virtually ceased to exist. On September 29th, the citizens of Seoul returned to pick among the rubble. General MacArthur and President Syngman Rhee rode triumphantly into the city. At the shell-torn national capital, with the smell of death everywhere, MacArthur turned the city back to Rhee. Said the tearful president, "We love you as a savior of our race." Whatever lay ahead, Incheon had been the general's finest hour. As UN forces pursued the defeated enemy northward, a MacArthur broadcast called for the North Korean army to lay down its arms. Specially equipped UN transports boomed surrender pleas to the fleeing enemy. Leaflets guaranteeing safe passage were also dropped. Entire units turned themselves into the 8th Army forces. In the center of Korea, Walton Walker's troops moved through Uijeongbu toward the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. On the east coast, ROK forces crossed the 38th parallel and struck out for the port city of Wonsan. Allowing American forces to cross the dividing line between North and South came amidst a confusion of opinions. Originally, only ROK forces were authorized north of the 38th. But newly appointed Secretary of Defense George Marshall urged MacArthur to feel unhampered in proceeding into North Korea. Said the general, "I regard all of Korea open to our military operations." Respectful of MacArthur's post-Incheon popularity, the Joint Chiefs gave him the broadest mandate, suggesting that military necessities dictate his future operations. In a highly controversial move, MacArthur pulled the 10th Corps out of the line for amphibious landings on the east coast of North Korea, designed to cut off retreating enemy forces. Many felt that Amund's Corps should join in a hot pursuit of the beaten enemy, but no one dared openly question the general's judgment. While ROK units drove up the east coast, the U.S. 1st Corps, spearheaded by the 1st Cavalry Division, pushed northward, seeking contact with the enemy. Under constant attack, Pyongyang was beyond hope. After exhorting his forces to fight to the last, Premier Kim Il-sung fled north. Supported by naval guns, South Korean troops entered the port of Wonsan on October 10th. 5 days later, President Truman flew to a Wake Island conference with General MacArthur. The two men now held widely differing views on the conduct of the war. A chilly atmosphere surrounded the brief talks. Truman was troubled by communist Chinese threats to enter the war in support of North Korea. But MacArthur saw little chance of any significant Chinese intervention. Optimistically, he predicted that the war would be over by Thanksgiving. South of Pyongyang, 8th Army troops began their advance on the city. Its fall would open the way for a rapid advance to the Manchurian border. There, tens of thousands of Chinese regulars were already crossing into North Korea. With the brilliant success at Incheon and the collapse of the North Korean defenses, the UN was no longer content merely to drive the aggressor from South Korea. Flushed with victory, the new goal was the unification of all Korea under one democratic government. Spurred on by Douglas MacArthur, the aim was to press onto the Manchurian border, destroy the North Korean military, and end the war. There were, of course, dissenters, those content with restoring the integrity of South Korea's border and looking to American interests elsewhere. They pointed to rumblings from Chinese Premier Chou En-lai that China would not sit idly by while UN forces approached Manchuria. But the threats were largely ignored by General MacArthur's Tokyo Intelligence Group, who, in a late September report, foresaw neither Soviet nor Chinese communist military operations in North Korea. The gap caused by differences in how to conduct the war continued to widen, with MacArthur on one side and President Truman and the Joint Chiefs on the other. But the general's stunning long-shot victory at Incheon had created something of an aura of infallibility about him. With a lifelong visceral commitment to fight communism wherever it existed, he pushed the UN Army northward, prepared to plunge his entire command into the frozen, forbidding mountains of northernmost Korea. Led by the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division, the 8th Army attack on Pyongyang began. With fewer than 8,000 defenders, the city was doomed. Even the departed Kim Il-sung's roving execution squads, ordered to shoot deserters on the spot, did not change the inevitable outcome. While 1st Cavalry forces battled in from the south, the Rock 1st Division attacked from the southeast. Soldiers of the British 27th Brigade joined the action. On October 19th, after 2 days of determined, if futile resistance, Pyongyang fell. MacArthur now established a new line of advance running from Sanshan on the west coast through Pyongyang northwest of the Chosin Reservoir to the east coast. The line roughly paralleled North Korea's frontier with Manchuria, 45 miles distant. Reinforcements continued to strengthen the UN command. Joining battalions from the Philippines and Australia, the U.S. 3rd Division moved into the 8th Army line. They were followed by a combat command from Turkey. MacArthur's intelligence chief, Major General Charles Willoughby, announced that organized resistance in North Korea on any large scale had ceased. Only delaying actions could be expected, he said. All along the UN front, the North Koreans began surrendering in ever larger numbers. Below the 38th parallel, General Walker's forces moved into the hills to rout out thousands of trapped North Korean guerrillas who would form pesky pockets of resistance. Eventually, all were eliminated. At a cemetery near Incheon, while ships were loading to carry them to Wonsan, men of the 1st Marine Division and their commander, Major General O.P. Smith, joined Army and ROC leaders in a silent tribute to their fallen comrades. At the same time, amidst reports of North Korean mistreatment of American prisoners of war, the 187th Regimental Combat Team was dropped 30 miles north of Pyongyang to seal off the northern escape route from the city. General MacArthur watched the operation. While the 8th Army pursued the beaten North Koreans alone, boats carrying the 1st Marine Division sailed back and forth off Wonsan while the harbor was cleared of Soviet mines. The weeks-long maneuver was laughingly called Operation Yo-Yo. Adding injury to insult, an epidemic of dysentery swept the Marine transports. Having been kept out of the war for several frustrating weeks, the Marines finally landed on October 26th to the good-natured jeers and catcalls of UN forces already holding the port. The 1st Marine Division moved out of Wonsan toward the upper reaches of North Korea. The weather was changing rapidly. Smith's troops braced for the onset of the frigid North Korean winter. When General Barr's 7th Division went ashore at Iwan, 180 miles to the north, a port also in UN hands, MacArthur's highly criticized 10th Corps move was mercifully ended. Under orders to make a rapid advance to the Manchurian border, the Army troops left Iwan. Even as they moved north, documents were being prepared to remove all but 3rd Division forces from Korea. Supply ships bound for Busan were being diverted to Japan. Tokyo victory parades were planned. Everywhere there was a going home optimism. Washington staff officers noted with deep concern the Taebaek mountain range separating the 8th Army and 10th Corps. Peaks soaring as high as 7,400 feet allowed for no communication between the two commands. In the event of trouble, one group could not come to the aid of the other. Despite the obvious danger, MacArthur sent his forces climbing towards Manchuria. While the 8th Army advanced up the west coast of North Korea, Smith's Marines moved into the tortuous mountains towards Udamni on the west bank of the Chosin Reservoir. Barr's 7th Division advanced along the reservoir's east bank in the general direction of Haisanjin. On October 25th, the 8th Army's northward advance was abruptly halted by strong attacks against the Rock 1st and 6th Divisions. After several days of hard fighting, they were forced back to the Chong Chong River. Then, on October 29th, units of General Barr's 7th Division also came under attack by powerful forces concealed near the Chosin Reservoir. During these actions, the first Chinese prisoners were taken. They reported that their forces were already in North Korea in great strength. But MacArthur's Tokyo Intelligence Office continued to dismiss the reports. With his right flank exposed by the rock collapse to the east, fearful of entrapment, General Walker began pulling back. The 8th Army's 2-month advance had ended. On November 1st, in the area of Shudong, the 7th Marine Regiment also encountered Chinese opposition. Enemy positions in the mountains were assaulted with the help of close air support. When the advance resumed, heavy fighting continued, but superior Marine firepower prevented an enemy breakthrough. The following day, as the wary Marines climbed the mountain road towards Kotori, the Chinese suddenly broke off contact. All along the front, an eerie silence descended. Had the Chinese attacks merely been a warning to stay away from the Yalu border? Why had they so mysteriously disappeared? And for how long? It was Thanksgiving Day, 1950. The battlefront lull was 2 weeks old. It would end in 24 hours with the launching of a UN offensive that Douglas MacArthur said would end the war. At the general's insistence, American B-29s and light bombers had been blasting the international bridges over the Yalu River, hoping to prevent the further incursion of Chinese troops into North Korea. MiG-15 fighters attacked the UN planes at will, then fled into the sanctuary of Manchuria. Hot pursuit had been denied the UN pilots by an administration determined to confine the war to Korea. On November 24th, General MacArthur flew to the front to watch the beginning of his offensive. "Tell the boys from me that when they reach the Yalu, they're going home," he said. While there was talk in Washington of stopping short of the border to assure the Chinese that no threat against Manchuria was intended, neither Truman nor the Joint Chiefs took any action to restrain their determined UN commander. At Haisanjin, where a spearhead of the 7th Division already held positions overlooking the Yalu, Major General Edward Almond flew in for a triumphant photo session. The moment was duly noted by the Chinese. In the west, the 80-mile 8th Army front now extended from Taishan through Unsan to Hanshan. In the 10th Corps area, the 1st Marine Division occupied positions running along the main supply route from Chinhung-ni to Udam-ni on the western side of the Chosin Reservoir. The Army's 7th Division was strung out along the east bank. The stage was set. The 8th Army moved out toward the Yalu frontier. A jittery General Walker sent a terse message to the colonel commanding his lead regiment. "Tell Stevens the first time he smells Chinese food, pull back." Walker's forces probed cautiously forward. For 24 hours, there was no sign of the Chinese. Spirits rose. Then from the mountainous territory surrounding the column, the Chinese initiated an attack. It was evident that strong forces were massed before the 8th Army. The fighting was intense. Gradually, Walker's forces were pushed back across the Hongchong River. The battle-weary U.S. 2nd Division moved forward to fight a delaying action, while the retreating 8th Army regrouped around Pyongyang. During subsequent intense combat, they suffered staggering losses. Pitiful thousands of North Korean refugees choked the roads leading south. Old people, women, children, most carrying their pathetic belongings, intermixed with the troops, trucks and tanks of Walker's withdrawing army. All along the route of retreat, heartbreaking scenes of human despair were replayed over and over. In the 10th Corps area, the 5th and 7th Regiments, spearhead of the 1st Marine Division, prepared to launch their own offensive. General Smith, with men strung out for 35 miles along the narrow, difficult-to-defend main supply route, felt his division was out on a limb. On the morning of November 27th, the 2nd Battalion of Colonel Ray Murray's 5th Regiment moved out of Udamni. The wind sweeping down from Siberia and across Manchuria shrouded the Marines in sub-zero weather. Within a mile, the battalion encountered heavy fire from the hills. The advance stopped. It was clear the strong concentrations of Chinese were strung out before them. Morning, November 28th. After a night of brutal human wave attacks, the Marines found that the road behind them had been cut. The column was trapped. On the other side of the Chosin Reservoir, elements of General Barr's 7th Division also came under attack. One group of 1,053 men struggled toward freedom. Only 181 came out. It was now clear that the Chinese were in North Korea in great strength. The retreating 8th Army was engaged with 180,000 men of the 4th Field Army. In the 10th Corps Zone, General Sung Shunlin's 9th Army Group was 120,000 men strong. The Chinese plan: to slice between the two commands, then fight west and east, thereby trapping the entire UN Army. A task force of 1,000 British and Americans under Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Drysdale moved out of Kotori, hoping to fight through to the trapped Marines. More than 30% were lost in the frozen hills. At Hagaru, 14 miles below Udamni, General Smith's Marines awaited the inevitable Chinese attack. It exploded violently the night of the 28th. Gutsy Marine defenders held. A cargo command began dropping supplies at the trapped Marines. The predicament had stunned the nation. For the first time, Douglas MacArthur's military judgments were being openly questioned. While the Marines held the key towns at Udamni, Hagaru, Kotori, and Shinhonni, the Chinese had cut the main supply route in many places. There was only one choice possible: the withdrawal of the entire 10th Corps to the port of Hungnam, 78 miles south. At 7 a.m. on December 6th, trailed by half-frozen refugees, the trapped men of the 1st Marine Division began their long march to freedom. Above them, Marine aircraft pounded the Chinese massed in the hills. When someone asked General Smith how it felt to retreat, he roared, "Retreat, hell! We're just advancing in another direction." Cut off by a Chinese army that lay concealed in the snow-covered hills, the 1st Marine Division continued its withdrawal. The column stopped frequently as advance patrols climbed into the hills to blast the Chinese from their positions. Bloodied survivors of Fox Company that had held Tok Tong Pass, commanding the path of retreat, were rescued after suffering terrible casualties. The weather was brutal. Sub-zero temperatures turned perspiration to ice inside boots. Hundreds fell victim to frostbite. The most serious were helped into trucks to join the wounded. Blood froze before it could coagulate. Corpsmen melted frozen morphine syrettes in their mouths. Plasma had to be heated for hours before it could be used. Above the column, Marine aircraft, guided by pilots in the line of march, harassed the Chinese with relentless attacks. Cargo planes kept a steady flow of supplies and ammunition raining down. In the late afternoon of December 3rd, having fought the enemy for every hill en route, the 2 Marine regiments moved into Hagaru. The most serious casualties were immediately airlifted out of the just completed strip. The men relaxed, but only briefly. What couldn't be carried out was destroyed. Camp was struck. It was time to move on. Early on December 6th, joined by Hagaru's defenders, the 10th Corps column again moved south. Every turn in the mountain road threatened to reveal the waiting enemy. Chinese troops, frozen and exhausted, began walking in to surrender. Most were in worse condition than the retreating Marines. Early on December 7th, the column made contact with an advance party of Colonel Puller's 1st Regiment out of Kotori. Several hours later, the line of 10,000 men and 1,000 vehicles began streaming into that mountain village. Since Koto's airstrip was too short to accommodate twin-engine transports, outmoded torpedo bombers and other light planes were used to take out the dead and wounded. More than 600 casualties were evacuated in this manner. The men were exhausted, but delay could be fatal. After containing a violent Chinese attack on the village, the long column moved out of Koto toward Chinhung-ni, 10 miles south. Within hours, an unexpected obstacle. A critical bridge had been blown, creating a 29-foot chasm in the narrow mountain road. No bypass was possible. The escape route was blocked. Marine engineers quickly huddled and came up with a solution. 8 steel treadway spans were airlifted to the scene and dropped by special parachute. Repairs were quickly made. Within hours, the column was again on the move. Many badly frozen Chinese, no longer capable of combat, were encountered. They joined the lengthening POW column. As they had all during the march, fleet carriers operating in the snow and bitter cold struggled to maintain their support of the 10th Corps retreat. Early on December 10th, the weary column began moving into Chinhung-ni. Their march from the Chosin Reservoir to Hungnam was half over. But the last leg was over flat country, and UN forces were in control most of the way. The men rested before the final move. Their terrible ordeal was almost over. At Hungnam, a vast fleet had gathered to evacuate the men of 10th Corps. Fearful that the 8th Army's headlong retreat might strand Aumann's troops in North Korea, MacArthur ordered the entire command taken by sea to Pusan. There they would become part of Walker's 8th Army, busily establishing a new line of defense north of Seoul. More than 100,000 men were to be removed from the area, a gradually shrinking perimeter protected by artillery and naval fire. On December 11th, the gallant survivors of General Smith's 1st Marine Division moved into Hungnam. True to Colonel Ray Murray's promise voiced at the Chosin Reservoir 2 weeks before, we're coming out with our dead, our wounded, and our equipment. were coming out as Marines or not at all. Prior to the evacuation, military stores were open to the starving civilians. Explosive charges were set in place. Troops and equipment began loading out. Room was found for 98,000 North Korean refugees, desperate to escape the approaching Chinese. By December 24th, Hungnam had been cleared. 500 tons of frozen dynamite, thousands of bombs were detonated, demolishing the port's facilities. The last of General Ammen's 10th Corps sailed away on Christmas Eve, 1950. Written off as doomed, they had come through. Behind them, in the frozen hills of North Korea, lay the shattered remains of a Chinese army that had tried to halt their glorious march to freedom. The nation had been stunned by the disaster at the Yalu. The press called it America's greatest defeat since Pearl Harbor. A Gallup poll revealed that 55% of all citizens thought that World War III had already started. On December 16, 1950, President Truman declared a state of emergency. The National Guard was called up. An Office of Defense Mobilization was organized. High-level discussions were held on use of the atom bomb against the Chinese. Douglas MacArthur seemed incapable of gracefully accepting the setback. He lashed out at the administration policies that restricted his execution of the war. He demanded the bombing of Manchuria, a blockade of China, and the use of nationalist Chinese troops in Korea. Outraged by the general's public outcries, President Truman issued a directive forbidding overseas officials, including military commanders, from making foreign policy statements without first clearing them with the State Department. With the Yalu defeat came the painful realization that there would be no victory in Korea. Talk of a negotiated peace was now heard in high places. A gloomy MacArthur charged that Washington had lost its will to win. On December 23rd, while riding toward the Korean front, Lieutenant General Walton Walker was killed in a Jeep accident. General Matthew B. Ridgway was ordered to Korea to take battlefield command of the UN Army. Following the longest retreat in U.S. military history, the battered 8th Army licked its wounds in new positions north of Seoul. The UN defense line now ran generally along the 38th parallel, the 1st and 9th Corps position north and west of Seoul. ROK forces held the mountains to the east. In the south, the 10th Corps, now part of the 8th Army, was busily reorganizing near Pusan. On December 30th, Lieutenant General Matthew B. Ridgway arrived in Korea. The pugnacious, by-the-book combat veteran of World War II, who had led the celebrated 82nd Airborne Division on D-Day, took over the UN Field Command. Unlike the late General Walker, the 55-year-old Ridgway had his commander's complete confidence. "Matt, the 8th Army is yours," MacArthur told him. "Do what you think is best." Troop morale was Ridgway's immediate concern. After its stinging Yalu defeat, the 8th Army was badly demoralized. The general set about restoring confidence, rebuilding an aggressive fighting spirit. The enemy gave the new 8th Army commander no time to settle in. On December 31st, their artillery lit up the Korean night. New Year's Day, 1951. 7 Chinese armies moved against the UN line. Seoul was again threatened. Fears of another Pusan perimeter loomed. Enemy crossings of the river east and west of the capital forced Ridgway to abandon the city. He ordered a retreat to the south bank of the Han. Refugees streamed southward across the frozen river, fleeing their homes for the second time in 6 months. Pitiful souls caught in the ebb and flow of war. Seoul fell January 4th. The new UN line now ran from Pyeongtaek east through Ansong and Wonju, the east coast town of Samcheok. When Wonju was abandoned, the 10th Corps moved northward to bolster the UN line. The 1st Marine Division was rushed out of reserve to support ROK units under heavy pressure in the east. Chinese casualties were tremendous. Their drive lost momentum. Ridgway quickly moved to the offensive. A series of January probes sought contact with the enemy. When no serious opposition was encountered, a major UN effort was planned. Operation Thunderbolt began as troops mounted up for an advance toward the Han River. The 10th Corps moved on Wonju. Finding it abandoned, they pushed on. By February 10th, the 1st Corps was digging in on the south bank of the Han. After a 48-hour Chinese drive was contained, the initiative again passed to the 8th Army. Ridgway pressed his advantage. On February 21st, he began his attack on Seoul. General MacArthur watched the opening moments of the offensive. As he continued to rail at Washington's restrictions on his command, intended to confine the war to Korea, the gap between himself and President Truman widened dangerously. By month's end, enemy resistance south of the Han had collapsed. Despite heavy spring rains that turned roads to mush, the UN drive culminated in the fall of Seoul on March 14th. By the end of March, the victorious 8th Army stood essentially along the 38th parallel at a line designated Idaho. By the first week in April, a further advance took them to the Kansas line, which ran along commanding ground just north of the parallel. Douglas MacArthur's festering differences with Harry Truman came to a sudden dramatic conclusion. Forbidden to carry the war to the Chinese mainland, saddled with what he called a no-win situation, MacArthur began a series of public statements harshly critical of administration foreign policy. Truman had had enough. On April 12th, he announced Douglas MacArthur's relief from command. 200,000 Japanese watched as the general left Tokyo. Jeannie, he told his wife, we're going home at last. The tumultuous welcome in San Francisco was indicative of weeks of public adulation that lay ahead. Americans swarmed about the MacArthur family in an emotional outpouring of love and gratitude. New York's ticker tape parade outdid those for past heroes, Lindbergh, Eisenhower. Oust President Truman signs were seen. Impeachment rumblings were heard in the Congress. But the belated thank yous seemed to lose sight of the bitter circumstances that had led to MacArthur's dismissal. Washington's greeting was a culmination of the hero's return. The crowning moment, a televised speech before a joint meeting of Congress in which MacArthur sought to justify his military decisions in Korea, while vigorously denying he had ever been insubordinate to his commander-in-chief. For America, it was an emotional farewell to a distinguished old soldier.
I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
With Matthew Ridgway now in Tokyo Command, Lieutenant General James Van Fleet, grizzly veteran officer, arrived to take over the 8th Army. His orders: conduct only limited actions for limited gains. On April 22nd, the Chinese greeted Van Fleet with the opening of their spring offensive. The UN was once again in retreat. Chinese spring offensive rolled forward, UN aircraft joined the battle. In the first hours, despite the force of the enemy attack, Van Fleet's line held firm. The Chinese poured out of a mountain flank build-up area known as the Iron Triangle. Their main effort hit the Seoul sector. Secondary thrusts were aimed at Yanshan in the center and Inji in the east. When ROK units in the central sector broke in confusion, Van Fleet ordered a series of withdrawals that ended at the Hongchong River. Within a week, the enemy was only 4 miles from Seoul. A new UN defensive position was established, designated the No-Name Line. It extended from just above Seoul, northeast across the 38th parallel to the east coast. The enemy gave Van Fleet no time for counteraction. On May 15th, the Chinese again attacked the center of the UN line. ROK troops broke in confusion. But intense UN artillery fire badly mangled the Chinese and forced their withdrawal. A second Chinese effort was also contained. Within 60 days, the UN had withstood 2 major enemy offensives. A series of 8th Army advances brought Van Fleet back to the Kansas line by the end of May. With peace now being vigorously pursued, the Joint Chiefs decreed that the 8th Army was not to move beyond the general vicinity of Line, Kansas. Only tactical operations are to be undertaken, those aimed at the protection of UN forces or to harass the enemy. Both sides began establishing defenses in depth. Efforts to end the fighting suddenly bore fruit. The Chinese and North Koreans agreed to the opening of peace talks. Kaesong, an enemy-held village in Western Korea, was chosen as a negotiating site. On July 8, 1951, a UN liaison party arrived at the dusty town for preliminary discussions with the other side. It was feared that the presence of communist armed guards might give the enemy a psychological advantage. On July 10th, General Ridgway saw the main negotiating team off to the talks. They were led by Vice Admiral C. Turner Joy, head of naval forces in the Far East. The communist team was headed by Lieutenant General Nam Il, an arrogant, chain-smoking North Korean officer. The real power, however, lay with the Chinese. The talks held in a Rococo tea house ran into immediate problems. Among them, agreement on a line of demarcation, conditions for withdrawal of opposing forces and the exchange of prisoners. The Russians suggested that the truce meetings proceed under a ceasefire, but fearing a Chinese buildup during the negotiations, the UN refused. During this period, field operations were limited to patrol activity and frontline skirmishing. As the peace talks droned on, blood continued to flow. At Kaesong, intent upon controlling news flowing from the truce site, the communists refused entry to a column of UN news representatives. An irate General Ridgway ordered the column to turn back. After tense negotiations, the communists relented and the talks resumed. On August 22nd, after falsely charging that a UN plane had bombed Kaesong, the communists broke off the talks. Savage combat soon erupted in an area of trackless hills and razor-sharp granite ridges known as the Punch Bowl. Located east of the Iron Triangle, the ridges afforded the enemy observation and artillery positions from which to harass the UN line. Beginning in late August, in some of the bloodiest fighting of the war, Marines and 2nd Division soldiers began attacks on the ridges. The tallest of these, known as Heartbreak Ridge, was 3,900 feet above sea level. Assaults were made up the steep sides against a deeply entrenched enemy. Napalm attacks burned away the hillside vegetation. Men crawled, hand over hand, to close with the enemy. Casualties were horrendous. Other attacks were made west of the Punch Bowl at a place called Bloody Ridge. Hilltops changed hands many times. But by late September, both Bloody Ridge and the Punch Bowl were in UN hands to stay. On October 22nd, the truce talks resumed. The new site, a tent at Panmunjom, a small village 6 miles east of Khe Sanh. Agreement was soon reached on a truce line. The months following, other difficult issues were resolved. But disagreement continued over communist insistence that, if necessary, prisoners of war must be forcibly repatriated. The UN held that prisoner return must be voluntary. Fearing mass defections, the communists were unmovable. Throughout 1952, both sides fought from inside a maze of interconnected bunkers. Trench warfare had come to Korea. Fighting involved patrol clashes, raids, and small unit struggles for outpost positions. Changes occurred that affected the war. In May, General Ridgway replaced Dwight Eisenhower as NATO commander in Europe. General Mark Clark took over as UN commander in Tokyo. That November, Eisenhower was elected president, defeating Adlai E. Stevenson. Ike kept an election promise by making a peace-seeking trip to Korea. In March 1953, Joseph Stalin died, resulting in new Kremlin leadership, more flexible in its attitudes toward the West. Some progress in the peace talks was indicated when Operation Little Switch saw the exchange of sick and wounded communist and UN prisoners. Month after weary month, in the tent at Panmunjom, issue after issue was laboriously resolved. Finally, the Chinese agreed to a form of voluntary repatriation. Operation Big Switch saw the return of 12,000 UN prisoners, including 3,500 Americans. At 10:03 a.m. on July 27, 1953, truce documents were signed at Panmunjom. General Mark Clark, signing as UN commander, expressed the frustration of many Americans when he said, "I cannot find it in me to exult at this hour." After 3 years, 1 month and 2 days, peace had come to Korea. The final truce line, running southwest to northeast, generally followed the 38th parallel, along which the war had begun. More than 2 million human lives before. When word of peace reached the United States, there were no celebrations or cheering crowds. Most Americans accepted the news with relief, happy that the long ordeal was over. One critic called the truce the last tribute to appeasement. General Omar Bradley would later characterize the conflict as the wrong war, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong enemy. But for many, America's stand in Korea was a turning point in the world's struggle against communism. The United Nations Charter had withstood its first test. An aggressor nation had been rebuffed, and the borders of an aggrieved democracy restored. Proper restraint had prevented the conflict from deteriorating into a global nuclear war. Unfortunately, after the disaster at the Yalu, the end was sadly predictable. As a long stalemate continued, most Americans returned to their daily routine, hardly aware that men were still bleeding and dying on remote Korean hilltops. When it finally ended, with 35,000 Americans dead and over 100,000 wounded, this war without victory was quickly forgotten. Remembered or not, it was a conflict that saw free nations join together for the first time to repel aggression. And it saw the beginning of a buildup of American arms, one that forged a military capability that remains the bulwark of freedom in a troubled and uncertain world. Reasons enough, perhaps, for America's forgotten war to be long remembered. I'm Robert Stack.